Welcome to Topic 6.7, Statistical Design and Planning, Data Collection and Management. Upon completion of Topic 6.7, you will be able to describe the role of data collection in data management and planning a study, identify modes of data collection and their pros and cons, construct a data collection instrument, understand the purpose of a codebook and create a codebook to document data collected, and understand the purpose of study protocols, including data collection protocols and how to create protocols. Data are raw, unanalyzed facts. Information is data processed into a meaningful form, but one person's information can be another person's data. Knowledge is knowing what information is required and what the information means. So how are these represented in research, data sets, results, and literature? What role does data management play? First, knowledge is needed to determine what data to collect and how to collect them, then provide data to be converted to information, and making sure that data are appropriately represented as information is turned into knowledge and into decisions. Data collection is the process of recording observations about your study sample that we can then use to make inferences about a population. In this topic, we'll primarily cover data collection via survey or interview. The components to data collection include, at the very minimum, measures of exposures and outcomes, sociodemographics and modifiers, and potential confounders. Data collection is one of the first components of data management, but first you must plan for the data needs of your study. The setup stage of the study is the most important step from a data collection and management perspective. Spending time here will save you so much more time later. This seems counterintuitive because, after all, there is no data yet to be managed, but this is where you decide what data you are going to collect, how you are going to collect it, who is going to collect it, when it is going to be collected, where it is going to be collected, and most importantly, why are you collecting these data? Why are data collected seems to be a rather odd question, but you need to determine what uses the data will be put to before you collect. Keep it simple. Does each question further the assessment of your research goals and hypotheses? Don't include variables because they might be significant unless you feel strongly enough about them to have included them in a hypothesis. Otherwise, you will end up with an unwieldy survey and a fishing expedition for your analysis. You should also start thinking about data security at this stage, including how will your data be securely entered, securely transferred to you, and how will it be securely stored once you get it. Common data collection instruments or modes of administration include interviews, whether in person or over the phone, telephone surveys, internet surveys, a medical bus or vehicle, health applications on smartphones, and other methods. What are some other methods that you may use for your study? Interviews are often used for a smaller group of subjects for a broad range of topics, but they can also be used for mid-sized studies. Structured interviews are essentially a survey, but administered by a person. There are typically fixed responses or multiple choice. Unstructured interviews include questions that differ for each subject and can be conditional upon responses to previous questions. They may have open responses. The pros of doing interviews are that you have control of the environment and you can probe for more information where necessary. You can also establish trust and rapport more easily in person, particularly when you have an interviewer who's from the community that you are studying. You can also use interviews to collect qualitative data. Cons are that it can be expensive to do. You have to hire and train individuals to conduct the interviews. You need the infrastructure set up to do them. That is, a device or electronic survey for data collection that the interviewer takes with them, or paper structured interview that they take with them, potentially recording devices. It can be burdensome because of the intensive human resources needed to conduct interviews, and it may limit your sample size. However, I would argue that the quality of data that you can get from an interview or an interview-assisted survey is worth the reduction in sample size. And you can easily conduct interviews and gain a sample of 500 people. In telephone surveys, trained interviewers contact and gather information from respondents. Random digit dialing might be possible if you have a list of phone numbers, although this has become much harder in the era of cell phones and smartphones and really may not be applicable. Pros are that it may be easier to access people than trying to interview in person, although not all people have a phone, or in the case of some countries, people don't answer the phone. You have good quality control if you train the interviewer and you have recordings of the surveys. And the anonymity may lead to more accurate responses. You can do quick data processing, particularly if you're using a computer-assisted telephone interviewing system, which is a specific system that collects and processes data as you are collecting them. Cons are that it is time-consuming and it can be hard to reach people. You might also be excluding populations who don't have a telephone. Internet surveys are surveys that are administered over a website. The pros are that they are quick and easy to implement, and you can use all kinds of free online platforms for data collection. You also are able to get anonymous responses. There's no interviewer burden, which may lead to better responses for sensitive topics, but you can do this in other modes as well. You just have to be creative. The cons are, who are your respondents? Will they have access to the internet? Will this lead to selection bias? How do you know who they are? When people are responding to a survey over the internet, you may not have a good way of confirming their identity unless you use specific email addresses or other personal information that only the person responding to the survey could provide. People tend to satisfice on internet surveys, which is a term that means they select the easiest answer so that they can skip quickly to the end. You have lower completion rates in internet surveys, and your data may not be as valid because you're unsure whether the person completing it is a real person who is interested in your study and is responding truthfully. It also excludes those who don't have access to the internet, and that can bias your study. You may also use a medical vehicle or trailer that takes everything that you need to conduct your data collection and sample collection to the community. The pros are that you can conduct surveys and interviews and collect medical specimens and anthropometrics. But the cons are that it can be very expensive to establish a medical vehicle and can also take a great deal of time to go into communities. Health apps are another option for data collection. The pros are that it's instant data and communication, and you can customize them to meet your study needs if you are able to have an app developer on your team. Cons are that it limits your participants to those who have smartphones, and that can bias your data. And the reach is suspect unless you are specifically creating it for your study participants. So how do you choose? Consider when you might prefer to use an unstructured interview or survey over structured. Typically, that is when you're doing exploratory studies or qualitative studies versus confirmatory or quantitative studies, and when you're trying to understand patterns. Consider the bias associated with each data collection format and weigh your trade-offs. Consider your resources and what you can do, and consider your population and how you might best reach them. Self-administered versus interviewer-assisted interviews and surveys. Typically, it's always better to be able to collect data from a person in person, unless the questions are deeply sensitive. But even then, you can allow the respondent to interact directly with a data collection tool for those sensitive questions. Interviewers can help prompt respondents, establish rapport, and explain instructions. Hiring interviewers from your target population improves participation by creating better trust and reliability. But interviewer bias is also very real. You have to train your interviewers, and you cannot do things like paying interviewers by the interview, for example. I am aware of a study that was done in that way, and it just creates an opportunity for fake data collection, for incentivizing approaching people who don't actually meet the study requirements, and for entering data quickly to skip on to the next person. In online versus in-person or over the phone, online leads to satisfying and lower response rates, and it is hard to trust the data. Telephone might improve your reach, but requires more resources. And in any case, paper is great for a record no matter the mode or the method. That way, you can check back and reference the paper records during data entry or when you're trying to understand discrepancies. No matter what, you need to back up your databases. A data collection instrument includes all of your survey questions and any instructions or scripts needed for the interviewer or respondent. It should include the source of all of your items and any psychometrics for those sources, or measures of reliability and validity. So how do you select and create measures for your data collection instrument? In general, you should choose, in this order, existing validated measures from well-established instruments. If you cannot find those, existing validated measures from well-established instruments that are slightly adapted to your population. Third, measures from instruments that have been previously used in your population but may not yet have validation. And finally, a last resort is measures that you or your study team create yourself. When you create as much of your survey instrument from validated and reliable measures as you can, this helps to create consistency in data collected across studies in the field, ensure that your measures are measuring what they're supposed to measure, the validity, every time, which is the reliability, and make it easier to reproduce the study in different populations. An exception to this is when the items don't fit your population's culture or beliefs. And when that happens, you can adapt measures to fit your culture, for example, types of foods eaten, behaviors, or certain beliefs, or create new measures to fit your population and test these before administering them in a survey if possible. And that could even be just on face validity that you test with a handful of members of the population to see if they make sense. An example of survey measures that have been tested and used in well-established studies and have the psychometrics reported for them are these measures. This is a scale of beliefs about lung cancer screening. created by Lisa Carter Harris. I have the publications that are the sources of the psychometrics, and also what the psychometrics are, such as a Cronbach's alpha of 0.89, and that there were found to be significantly lower perceived barriers for people who had been screened versus those who had not. But this item contains all of the information I need to know how much I can trust these survey measures to measure what I'm interested in understanding about my population. An example of an adapted measure is this first question about what kind of place do you usually go when you are sick or need advice about your health. The question stem was kept about the same, but this question was being asked in a rural population that had different options for receiving medical care, such as a place called remote area medical. And so we wanted to make sure that we included that in the response options. So we adapted it for our population's culture and behaviors. Creating your own survey measure should only be done when there is no previous evidence of measures that fit your need or that can be adapted to fit your need, or for items that are specifically about the very study you are conducting. In this example, participants were from a parent study about using a self-administered vaginal swab to test for the human papillomavirus, or HPV. We wanted to know who participants spoke to about being in that study and had to create a question and responses for topics they may or may not have discussed with anyone about the study. These items were so unique and specific to the study they had to be created. But 97% of measures in this survey were from previously validated studies. I will very briefly cover designing your own survey questions, but you can go back and look at this at your own pace. First, remember your survey's purpose. Every question you have should support your reason for conducting the study. And if you're in doubt, throw it out. Keep your questions simple, break them down into component parts, and stay focused. Avoid vague issues like when was the last time you ate rice, instead of specific questions on how many days of the past 7 days did you eat rice. If a question can be misinterpreted, it will be. Be clear and concise, beware of imprecise language, and avoid double negatives. And make sure the respondent has enough information to respond. Sometimes it may be beneficial to break down questions that require background information into 2 parts. Include only one topic per question, meaning avoid double-barreled questions. You can't ask someone to rate their satisfaction with the amount and kind of care. You need to ask amount and kind in 2 different questions. Avoid leading questions. You don't want someone to hear, most doctors believe that eating vegetables is good for you. Do you agree? Even the most well-intentioned person can slant results by including too much information in a question. And consider alternate ways to ask questions that might get biased responses. There's some questions that are obviously sensitive, but some questions are just about beliefs or behaviors you may not realize could bias the person's response. Instead of asking, did you vote in the last election, you may say, there are many reasons why people don't get a chance to vote. Sometimes they have an emergency, or are ill, or simply can't get to the polls. Thinking about the last election, do you happen to remember if you voted? Also, people are less likely to lie about their age in face-to-face interviews if they're asked what year they were born rather than how old they are. Make sure your response options are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Keep open-ended questions to a minimum, and remember that people interpret things differently, particularly when it comes to time. You can get a lot of trouble with responses like always, sometimes, and never, and you may want to provide context for those. If possible, always use a don't know response for people, and allow them to refuse a question, although don't offer a refusal. Provide a meaningful scale. The endpoints of response scales must be anchored with meaningful labels. So if you say rate on a scale of 1 to 5, you need to let them know what 1 means and what 5 means. It doesn't really matter how many scale points there are. That's just a matter of taste. And here are some things to remember when constructing a response scale. I'm going to talk for a moment about creating code books. You should first compile these measures in a word processing document and then begin to label them for a data collection instrument. If it's electronic, construct the measures, create a codebook with variable information, and then enter the data into a survey creation interface, and you can finally print a paper version that can be used as a backup. If you're using a paper instrument, you could do the same steps so that you have the data collection database ready and then create the paper instrument separately or use the printed version. Data collection tools that are electronic are relatively common and accessible. What do you have access to, and what tools do you prefer? Are you collecting data in the field? Do you need internet access or the ability to record images or audio? You can use some standard data entry or collection forms like Google Forms, Qualtrics, REDCap, Microsoft Access, SurveyMonkey, or customized programs and apps. The most fundamental components of a codebook are the variable name, label, and description, which is typically the question, as well as the type of variable, the code values and value labels for every response option, as well as missing value codes. You may also include the variable length or column location. A codebook is a document that describes the contents, structure, and layout of a data collection. It should contain all of the information you need to understand each variable in a file. They are very important for consistency and transparency in research, allowing for data reproduction. It usually begins with some front matter that includes the study information such as title, principal investigator, table of contents, and format. The front matter might also include additional methodological details like sampling scheme and how weights are computed. Here's an example of a page of a codebook. You'll see in the first column is the variable name. The second column has the variable label, such as age or postal code, or the variable description, which is the question stem. Value codes for categorical variables are in the next column, and the value labels for each response option are next, including missing value codes and labels. The final column contains the format or type of variable, for example, numeric or text. This is a basic codebook created before data collection from a study that I conducted, and it contains the variable description or label, the question, the response options and value codes for each, as well as for missing values, the variable name, and the source of each item that was used in the study. A more detailed codebook might contain transformations and recoding of basic variables, descriptive characteristics, and as mentioned previously, source of variables and potential sampling scheme and data collection instruments themselves. You may include procedures for data collection and data entry. However, I tend to create separate protocols for these procedures. This is an example of a set of individual variables or questions that make up a score, and then the data transformations that were used to create the composite score and a mean score. This is another example of a more detailed codebook of a state vital statistics code manual for births in the state of Florida. It includes the same basic components, plus the item number, the years the variable has been collected, and other data sets that contain this variable. You might create a codebook for use before data collection that contains all of the basic information you need for each variable in order to create the data collection instrument. After data collection occurs, you can add information to the codebook, including information on variable position and format in the data set, and basic descriptives of each variable, such as count and percent for categorical variables, and measures of central tendency and dispersion, such as mean and standard deviation, for continuous variables, and the system missing values and valid count for each variable. In this example, you can see a question from the pre-data collection codebook and the information added for this variable into the codebook once data collection has concluded. The additional information includes more descriptives of the variable itself and the counts and percents for each value of response. It also includes system missing data, which means that for some reason there's missing data on that variable that was not indicated as missing by the person collecting data. This may also appear when some questions are the result of display logic and may not be asked of all participants. If you're conducting a longitudinal study, you'll typically be asking a set of questions at baseline and then a set of questions that are asked at each follow-up, some of which will be the same as baseline and some that are not. But typically the follow-up questions will be the same at each follow-up wave. In this example, this codebook shows questions for follow-ups at time 5, time 6, time 7, and time 8. The variables are appended with the number of the wave at the end, and there's slightly different information about the location of the variable in the data collection instrument for each wave. In summary, you may include this additional information for each variable in the dataset and any other information that might be useful to you to have in the codebook. There are some problems to avoid encoding data. For instance, you want to make sure that if you are including code values for missing data, those values are not equivalent to a valid value in the data. In this example, don't know or not sure is missing data coded with the value 8, and refused is missing data coded as 9. However, as you can see in running frequencies of the variables, all of the values for children ages 8 years old and 9 years old are not present, and there are many respondents coded as don't know or refused. What has happened is that all children who are 8 or 9 years old are accidentally put into the missing data categories. I'm going to talk next about the importance of creating protocols for your study. Written protocols are essential not only to data management, but to every process of your study. Written protocols should be created for every task in your study, from recruitment through data collection, participant management, and data management and analysis. You should then train your study staff using these protocols. Protocols include step-by-step instructions for how to carry out all aspects of the study. You can include decision trees or decision logic for complex processes that may have several courses of action. The goal is to leave very little up to the study staff to decide, so that you are creating an environment in which fidelity to the study plan can be the default course of action. Protocols can be updated as needed, and when they are, staff should be retrained on that protocol. Here's an example of a protocol for how to carry out a randomized controlled trial. The protocol first consists of a list of all materials needed to conduct the experiment, URLs or website links to all software or information needed to conduct the study, and in this case, a list of the study arms and the color and code on the chips that are assigned to those study arms for non-replacement randomization to study groups. Two more examples from this protocol are the instructions to set up the study at each desk in the laboratory and how to conduct the randomization process, which consisted of participants blindly pulling a colored chip from a bag that indicated their study group. Other parts of this protocol that are not shown are the consent process, how to run the experiment, how to distribute incentives, and breakdown of the study site at the end of each day. This is an example of a protocol used to begin the process of calling participants for survey data collection over the phone. you'll see that it begins with where to find contact information for each study participant, the internet addresses for the data collection software programs needed for data entry, login information, and who to contact in case the software programs don't work properly. Next, how to find the calendar that lists which participant is meant to be contacted that day, and how to begin a call and thoroughly document any call attempts and the outcomes of each. There are exact scripts for talking with participants and decision trees for what to do in case of every possible response. Again, documenting the action that occurred on the call and a list of what-ifs in case participants ask specific questions in the process of the interview. Field data collection can be particularly tricky, and you need to make sure your study staff has everything they need to complete data collection. This includes anyone they should call for questions and their contact information, what they need to have with them, and what actions to complete before leaving for the field, how to access software, how to document participants, and it continues on to describe step-by-step survey administration, what to do when the survey is complete, and importantly, how to return to an incomplete interview if their data collection process is interrupted. This will happen, so it's very important to have a plan in place. For complex studies, I highly recommend creating a detailed protocol with a table of contents and screenshots of steps with software programs for training, and then creating quick reference or cheat sheets for brief reference when study staff are more accustomed to data collection. I know that you won't be able to read these pages, but these are 4 pages of the protocol from the previous slide. I wanted to demonstrate that there are detailed instructions, including screenshots for each step of data collection. Documenting every step of the process with screenshots of the processes helps to reduce ambiguity, helps for people who are visual learners, and allows the study staff to reference specific pages or screens when reporting issues or asking questions. You can give interviewers a quick start list that they can take with them to perform data collection in the field. In the second example, these are a list of steps required to track and mail incentives to participants in a study. There are simply so many small steps needed in all of these processes that you don't want to leave a study staff person trying to figure out what they're supposed to do. Protocols for downloading, exporting, cleaning, and validating data are essential. For studies with multiple waves of data, checking for complete data across all waves for every participant is important, and data may need to be merged into a single data set. You should have instructions for flagging any discrepancies and how to resolve them. While creating protocols takes time in the planning of your study, investing the time in creating protocols and training study staff on these protocols saves a tremendous amount of time and resources spent on correcting errors and reducing ambiguity later. It also greatly increases the rigor and internal validity of your study and allows for transparency so others can see exactly how your study was run, which is important for reproducibility as well as for demonstrating that all procedures were done ethically. In summary, data collection is how we make observations of our sample and translate them into inferences about our population. The mode and method of data collection will depend on your specific research question and population. Use existing validated measures whenever possible. Create codebooks to organize and summarize data. Create protocols for every part of study implementation to reduce ambiguity and increase fidelity and rigor. And in final thoughts, taking time to carefully plan all aspects of data collection and study implementation and thoroughly training study staff before you ever begin collecting data will save time and resources spent on correcting errors later. Thank you.